Hello and welcome to Module 11, once again, this time to the Part 2 presentation, Eyewitness Evidence.
You will recall that in Module 3 we discussed some general issues surrounding the admissibility of eyewitness identification procedures of suspects. And in this section, I'm not going to be talking so much about that in terms of a legal concept. Rather, I'm going to address this from the perspective of the psychology of eyewitness testimony and identification evidence. And this is equally important to an understanding of the entire process, and it will also demonstrate why eyewitness testimony can clearly be felt to be less than reliable. As a prosecutor, for example, I usually prefer to have circumstantial evidence, and of course now especially forensic science evidence, but circumstantial evidence to support and buttress any eyewitness testimony that I might have in a case, because of the susceptibility of misperception and misidentification that's always present in eyewitness testimony and identifications. So let's talk for a little while about it. First, I'm going to point out two textbooks that I think are certainly worth searching for online and purchasing if you wish to do any additional reading in this subject matter. And it is a very interesting subject matter. The first is Psychology, Law, and Eyewitness Testimony by Peter Ainsworth. And the second is Eyewitness Testimony, Elizabeth Loftus. Both of these people are experts in the area of the psychology of eyewitness testimony. And Elizabeth Loftus, if you read any further, will come up often in the readings as an individual called to testify as an expert in cases to establish eyewitness testimony veracity. These are older books, but you can still get them online in a used format. And using these two books, you can jumpstart any other online inquiries that you might want to conduct in this area, because there is a huge amount of commentary in psychological journals and a lot of commentary in legal journals as well, and law review articles. So it's a huge area, and needless to say, I'm very, very limited in the amount of material I can discover. I can only touch on some of the issues that are prevalent in this. The first thing I want to mention with you is that there are three stages of memory, according to the writings. The first is the acquisition of information. The second is the retention of that information. And the third is the retrieval of material previously learned. When a witness sees a serious event, such as a crime or traffic accident, and then has to recall it later, three major stages are identifiable. In the acquisition stage, the numerous factors that will affect the accuracy of the initial perception exist. Some of these factors, such as the amount of time the witness had to look at whatever's going to be remembered, are inherent in the situation itself. But other factors, such as the amount of stress a witness is experiencing, are inherent in the witness as opposed to the situation. Both event factors and witness factors can dramatically affect a witness's ability to perceive accurately. Once information enters memory, it may reside there for quite a while before the witness attempts to recall it. There is a new set of factors that come into play when a witness attempts to recall what they've seen. And there are steps in this so-called process of perception that are significant. First of all, the process of perception has been described as a top-down process and a bottom-up process. And considering these terms here, the bottom-up process is said to be driven by the input itself. We recognize a chair simply because its physical configuration matches that which we have encountered before. That is to say, we have a mental template for the object chair. The object has 4 legs, a flat seat, a back, and it's identified as a familiar object, in this particular case, a chair. However, an individual might also recognize the object by using a more top-down process. The individual might notice that the object is propped up against a table, each side of which has a similar-looking object leaned against it. The fact that at the next table people are sitting on these things would also lead a person to label the sensory input as a chair. Most everyday perception may well be of the bottom-up type and be accurate. However, many cases of eyewitness testimony involve top-down processing, leading to a more subjective and possibly inaccurate interpretation. Bottom-up processes may be more appropriate for the perception of simple objects, while top-down processes would be used in the perception of more complex events and incidents. This context and expectation can play a major role in perception and affect the top-down processing of criminal acts, traffic accidents, etc. A person entering a large classroom would probably have no difficulty in recognizing a chair. Perception as interpretation. Here's we start into some very serious issues. Humans may only become aware of the complex processes of perception when an input is novel or ambiguous. Suppose for example, a person is a passenger seated in a stationary train and another train is stopped alongside. We've all experienced this. One train starts to move, but for the first few moments, it's not possible to establish whether it's the person's own train that is moving or the one alongside. The reason for this confusion is that the visual information which the person receives is the same, whether it is his or her own other train which starts to move first. In such circumstances, the person may well look out of the window on the other side of the train in order to check if the scenery appears to be moving. Alternatively, the person might check to feel if there's any vibration coming from the train in which he or she is sitting. In either of these cases, the traveler would conclude that it was his or her own train that was indeed now moving. So we can say fairly quickly, human perception is not an objective, static, and totally accurate process. Instead, it's one that is active, creative, and subjective. Humans do not simply record chunks of data which they encounter. Rather, they sift it, interpret it subjectively, and then record that interpretation. And that's what they remember. That our perception is neither objective nor always accurate will be demonstrated by some visual illusions I'll show you later in this lecture. Bias and subjectivity in perception. Humans tend to make the best bet as to what is actually out there in the world, yet they don't realize that this is just an educated guess for the most part. In addition, perception fills in any missing parts to make a complete picture. An artist uses their own interpretation of a scene, translates that into a visual imagery, and then creates something unique on the canvas. 10 artists painting the same scene would all produce a slightly different end product. While there would be some common themes present in all of the paintings, each one would have its own idiosyncrasies and subject interpretations. Some artists might have chosen to highlight one particular aspect of the scene, while others may have almost ignored it. Some artists may have sought to create a certain mood or atmosphere in the scene through the use of color or light and shade. and some might be more accurate than others in the detail. Further compounding this whole problem, there's a lot of reasons why witnesses might interpret a scene or situation differently. Some features of perception are undoubtedly inherited. Most perceptual skills, however, are learned. Learning and experience, as how it co-joins with perception, is a very important part of this concept, because each human experiences subtle differences in their upbringing, so their perception of events will be slightly different. If a police officer stands up in court and says, "My attention was drawn to the suspect because he was acting suspiciously," what does this mean? Would a civilian viewing the same action perceive them as suspicious? Because of the nature of their work, police officers spend a lot of time looking out for people who are or who are perceived to be acting suspiciously. Because perception is largely a learned process, it draws heavily on personal experience. The more familiar a setting becomes, the less time and effort people devote to examining its features. A motorist who witnesses his or her first serious traffic accident may be overwhelmed by any physical carnage at the scene and find it difficult to make any sense of what happened. By contrast, the experienced police officer who's dealt with many such incidents will be able quickly to take in all of the relevant information and decide on a course of action. Serious road accidents, assaults, and armed robberies are relatively rare. What that means is that for most witnesses, it will be their first and only time of experiencing such an event. And for this particular reason, processing the inputs may prove difficult, whether from a top-down or bottom-up perspective. Many simply misinterpret the event and assume that there's an innocent explanation for what's taking place. Because of this, they will pay little attention to the incident itself or interpret it inappropriately. Little in their past will have prepared them for such an event, and consequently, their perceptual processes may well find it difficult to interpret and then record features of the scene. Such inexperienced witnesses may not express themselves well in court. In addition, an individual's perception is directly affected by not only their expectations, that is, what they expect to see under the circumstances, but also based upon their past experience in general. Those who have seen a large number of accidents or robberies, for example, make better witnesses than those who witnessed such an incident for the first time. Experience will mean that a witness will be less fazed by the incident, and it is possible that this very experience may lead to distortions in perceptions. Let me give you just a personal example. On one occasion, another prosecutor and I were having dinner in a restaurant near our courthouse, and it became apparent that some kind of a confrontation was taking place a couple of doors down on the same street. We went out to observe and saw two off-duty police officers who we knew in a struggle with three suspects who were fighting to keep from being arrested. Eventually, the three individuals were subdued, handcuffed, placed in police vehicles, and taken to police headquarters. The next day, both myself and the other prosecutor, were contacted by the Internal Affairs Office of the police department and asked to come in to give statements because these three individuals had claimed police brutality in the jail. So we both dutifully went and gave our statements. And I was able to give a very, very detailed statement, while the other prosecutor could have very little recollection of the events other than the general circumstances. And later on, he asked me, "How did you remember all that?" And I said, well, it was very simple. I knew as soon as I came on the scene that I would probably be a potential eyewitness if called. So I concentrated on what I was seeing to remember it. I looked at what was important. To me, I looked at what was material to the situation, and I remembered it, and I focused. And as a result of that focus, I was able to testify with complete confidence that the injuries which the three suspects complained about having occurred in the jail actually occurred during the process of their resisting arrest, because I had an opportunity to see these three people once they had been reduced to custody and placed in the police cars. And I saw this up close and personal. And as a result, the brutality complaint about the jail was dismissed, as it should have been. But there's an example of our expectations and our past experience and being aware of what we're seeing might be important. And of course, it was my legal training that brought all that into play, and especially my prosecutorial experience, because I knew what was material and I knew what was relevant, and I knew to record in my mind what I felt was actually going on. Now, psychologists have known for a long time how stereotypes and expectations can come into play when viewing a scene. And again, the police officer may reach an inappropriate conclusion when viewing an accident, assuming the cause is obvious when this is not necessarily so. One of the consequences of the process of perception is that individuals tend to see, and I guess I should say, actually, they tend to perceive what they expect to see. That people that tend to perceive what they expect has been demonstrated in all sorts of different ways. One common method is to show audiences a picture containing an error and then ask people what they believe they saw. And we'll do this in a couple of minutes later on in this lecture to give you an example of how that does work. And I will give you another personal example. I was a member of one of the Inns of Court, of the American Inns of Court process, and during our formal dinners that we held once a month, after eating, we would have a discussion on some topic of trial significance, because this was a group of trial lawyers and county judges. During this process, I staged an incident, and when we were all seated in this very formal dining room eating, there came a knock at the door, and I, knowing this was going to happen, was seated close to the door. I got up, opened the door, and a uniformed county police officer brought a scruffy-looking individual into the room in handcuffs. The officer also had in his other hand a briefcase of the type that lawyers typically carry. And he said to the group, while I was patrolling nearby, I heard the sound of glass breaking coming from this parking lot. So I pulled in, and I saw this individual standing next to an automobile, and he was holding a briefcase, this briefcase. He described the vehicle in general terms without naming the license plate and held up the briefcase, while another lawyer who was on the other side of the room, another trial lawyer, defense lawyer, it turns out, was in on the deal, and he stood up and said, that sounds like that's my car from the description. And he says, and that looks like my briefcase. So the officer said, well, what's the combination on the briefcase? So this individual read off 3 numbers, and the officer recited the numbers again, but he recited them backwards. At that point, I intervened and said, I'm sorry, officer, but we're having a dinner here now, and perhaps the attorney here can go out with you and determine what's going on here. So they left for a moment, and then, of course, the lawyer came back in, because then I said to the group, all right, ladies and gentlemen, this was a test of your ability to perceive. And questionnaires were handed out. A half a set of the questionnaires were full of front-loaded leading questions, and the other half were normal, straightforward, non-leading questions. And the questions were such like describe the suspect. we got all kinds of different descriptions of this scruffy-looking guy. And he was indeed scruffy-looking. In fact, he was an undercover narcotics police officer, which is why he looked the way he did. And, of course, both of these officers were doing this voluntarily at my request and with the knowledge of the police chief. So we got really wide-ranging descriptions with respect to the questions relating to what, if any, offense had occurred. The lawyers, most of them said, well, it was so-and-so's car that was broken into by breaking a window, and his briefcase was removed. Well, there was no evidence that, first of all, the car belonged to this lawyer, and secondly, there was no evidence that any windows in the car had been broken. Nothing was ever discussed on that issue. And in fact, a number of people said, well, it was the window that was the rear passenger window, or the rear driver's side window, that was broken, because that's where the officer said the fellow was standing, next to the rear passenger window, or rear driver's window, rather. All of this was infused into this identification process. And this, ladies and gentlemen, were attorneys, trial lawyers, who were caught unawares in a situation and tried to make the best of it. Of course, they got the combination on the briefcase wrong, many of them because of the officer repeating the numbers in reverse order. But one of the responses was very, very shocking to all of us, and these responses were all anonymous. The individual who wrote the response said, well, the individual is entitled to a fair trial, and he won't get one in this county because all of the county's judges were present in the room. Therefore, the case will have to be sent to another county for trial. Why is that shocking? This was a questionnaire on what was a staged event. And somehow or other, this person just didn't connect the dots. So this is the way things work in the real world. Now, let's get back to the specifics here. Witnesses who appear in court genuinely believe that they're giving an objective recollection of an incident, when in reality they're giving a story based upon a biased and self-serving interpretation. And this biased and self-serving interpretation is not anything that's meant to be derogatory. It's just they're biased because of their past experiences and biased based upon how they've experienced things in the past. You can only make a decision on what something is by what your experience is. Because if you don't have any information to qualify your discussion and to compare what you've seen with, you can't describe it except in terms you know. Now, I'm going to give you an example here. In a recent case that I was involved in, the defense lawyer said that the prosecution was offering voodoo science. And my observation in response to that was that perhaps this lawyer was actually telling the truth, and that to him, this was voodoo science that was being presented with respect to the odor mortis and the smell of death. And my basis for saying that was, well, if, for example, we took someone from the high jungles in Borneo and they came down from their village for the first time in their life and they saw in front of them a lie detector or something more complex, GCMS, gas chromatography mass spectroscopy machine, having no experience whatsoever with what these things could possibly be, it's not surprising that this Borneo native may consider this to be witchcraft, magic, and voodoo science, because that's all their experience can tell them that it is. So they have to describe it that way. And I have to say that my belief is that's the reason we got a lot of UFO reports, and certainly a lot of reports about people seeing ghosts. The same concept. They see something, they can't explain it accurately, so they fall back on what they think it must be, and then that becomes what it actually is in their mind. That perception is what's preserved. So this is a serious issue in terms of eyewitness perception. Okay, let's give another example, a fictional example. Two men are seen leaving the scene of an apartment that they've just burglarized. A witness gets a closer view of one of the men and recognizes him as an acquaintance. Although the witness didn't get a good look at the other man, the witness identifies the other man as being a close friend of the first man. The second person has an ironclad alibi. He was in another state at the time of the burglary. So these associations are subconsciously put together. So I know this guy, and I know he's there, and I recognize him, but this other person I don't know, but I have reason to believe that he was a good friend of this first guy, so it must be the other individual that I saw. And of course, there's no logical connection there. It's an inference that the witness is drawing subconsciously based upon their past experience. The next set of concepts in the process of perception involve, first of all, cultural expectations. There's 4 or 5 different kinds of expectations that directly affect perception. The cultural expectations, as I've said, personal prejudices, temporary biases, and perpetual activity. Incomplete knowledge sort of falls in beside these other 4. And again, the example I gave of the train moving is a very good example of incomplete knowledge. I'll show you a couple more later on. A cultural expectation is just a belief held by a large number of people within a given culture. Sometimes it's attributed indiscriminately to all members of the group or to all situations of a given type. Thus, many people believe that persons of Asian background are particularly tidy, or that fat people are jolly, or that pool halls are sleazy. Cultural expectations, occasionally referred to as stereotypes, are usually simple and widely accepted, but are often highly inaccurate. And cultural expectations can dramatically affect perception. And I'll show you a really notable example of that later on. In discussing the importance of expectations, 2 researchers, Allport and Postman, have stated that things are perceived and remembered the way they usually are. Thus, a drugstore in one stimulus picture is situated in the middle of a block, but in the telling, it moves up to the corner of the 2 streets and becomes the familiar corner drugstore. A Red Cross ambulance is said to carry medical supplies rather than explosives because it ought to be carrying medical supplies. Kilometers on signposts are changed into miles, since Americans are accustomed to having distances indicated in miles. Personal prejudices. Just as it's true that large groups of people can hold certain stereotypic beliefs that will affect perception, it's also very true that an individual can have personal prejudices that will affect their perception. Like cultural stereotypes, these personal beliefs are usually simple, usually applied to a given person, group, or situation, and are very often, again, untrue. Thus, if someone believes that all women are lousy drivers, this can affect his ability to accurately perceive a situation in which a woman is at the wheel, or a young woman in Gainesville driving while on the cell phone, maybe. That's my personal favorite, personal prejudice. And let's not forget the football game and the penalties. Reel and imagine as to what people on different teams, rooting for different teams, perceive as being penalty calls versus not calling the penalty. And then we've got some temporary biases that come into play, and they usually, we see them in crimes and traffic accidents and hunting accidents. Hunting accidents are particularly offer many opportunities for seeing how this temporary bias can be, because most people aren't aware of just how many hunting tragedies occur because of misleading expectation. During the 1974-75 hunting season, for example, hunting accidents took the lives of at least 700 people. The nation's newspapers occasionally report these incidents, but this doesn't stop them. An example of an 18-year-old Wilmington boy wearing a squirrel skin cap was shot to death. Another was killed and struck in the head by a bullet fired by his cousin. And an 18-year-old deer hunter was shot to death 10 days after his father died in a hunting accident. Many of these deaths are especially tragic because the victims are shot by a relative or close friend. And the biases here, the temporary biases, are that people expect to see what they're looking for. And in these situations, animals, squirrels, for example, or deer, and when they see something moving and it's brown or looks like it's got fur, they shoot at it. And of course they shouldn't, without really knowing exactly what it is they're shooting at. So there's a problem there, but that's separate. But again, it's a question of perception as to what they think they're seeing, which of course is why hunters these days, smart hunters, if they're out wandering, wear bright colors, orange vests and so forth, so that they won't be mistaken for animals in the woods. Perpetual activity. While an event is being experienced by a witness, there's a lot of other activities that can be engaged in. An eyewitness to a robbery could spend a good deal of time examining the individual features of the face, or he might spend most of his time staring in the direction of the face, but might actually be trying to figure out how to escape from this unpleasant situation. Another perpetual activity situation is driving on a motor vehicle. You're driving on the highway in the evening or late at night, and especially on the interstates, and your mind starts to drift away, and you're really not paying attention to what's in front of you, despite the fact that you're looking at the road right in front of you. Your mind has sort of tuned out the visual input and is now thinking about the music that you're listening to, or the radio program, or the audio book, or thinking about what you're going to do when you arrive at your destination. And while the information is out there and you are, quote, seeing, close quote, the road in front of you, you're not perceiving it. And that's otherwise called highway hypnotism. It's not really a hypnotism. It's just that you're refocused on something else instead of driving the car. And I don't think it's excused upon an accident that a lot of people get in these automobile accidents in the middle of the night on an interstate when there's virtually no traffic on the road. You'll see very often people pulling off to the side of the road in the middle of the night. They leave their lights on, so the driver 2 miles behind them comes up. He sees the red lights on the car peripherally. He sees that, but he doesn't really perceive that the car is stopped on the side of the road. It's just another car in front of him, and he gets behind it and hits it, not realizing that the car is not moving. The perception is the car's in the lane in front of them, so it's okay. And as I've said before, incomplete knowledge is an input that has nothing to do with the scene per se. It's something that a witness in general knows about in advance and applies their understanding of the situation to the event that they're witnessing or trying to perceive. And the moving train, of course, is a good example of that. Let's talk for a few minutes about memory for events. Some event factors, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Exposure time. How much time has an individual actually had to make a determination? And it may be a matter of moments to minutes to a half an hour, or more. And needless to say, the more exposure time you have to an individual, that is a crime occurring, and to the criminal perpetrating it, the more likely it is you're going to be able to provide more and more detail about not only what you're seeing, what the person did, what the person said, but what the person looks like also, and their features become more ingrained. So exposure time is a very, very important aspect, and the courts will look at exposure time in determining the credibility of a witness. who is giving an eyewitness identification. Another factor is crime seriousness and how that distracts people from adequate perception. They see something going on, but they don't perceive everything that's going on because they have weapon focus, for example. They're looking at that gun, and they're looking at the hole of the end of the barrel, and it just looks bigger and bigger and bigger. Or they look at a knife, for example. This kind of focus tends to detract from an eyewitness identification. And it's not that the person can't make an identification. They may have a general perception of what their assailant or the suspect looks like, but they can't describe it with enough detail to make it useful even for arrest purposes to describe the suspect, because they just haven't stored enough information. They've looked at something else. They've focused on something else because of the seriousness of the crime and because of the weapon that they're looking at. And then, of course, on top of it is the sort of the mother of all event factors, and those are, of course, stress. Stress can completely shut down your perception process. And strong motivational states, such as stress or other emotional arousal, facilitate learning and performance up to a point, but after that, it starts to tail off rapidly and becomes a detriment. And the location of the point at which the performance begins to decline is determined by the difficulty of the attack, according to a number of studies. One in particular, a mild level of emotional arousal tends to produce alertness and interest in the task at hand. When emotions become intense, decrement in performance occurs. At high levels of arousal, performance begin to decline, and a well-learned habit would be much less susceptible to disruption by emotional arousal than a more complex response that depends upon the integration of several thought processes. In a moment of intense fear, for example, a person would probably still be able to spell his name, but his ability to play a good game of chess would be seriously impaired, if not completely prevented. Memory for events. Some witness factors. Age. The age of an eyewitness can be very important in terms of what they perceive. A very young child perceives things completely differently from adults because of their experience level and the things that attract them as earlier children or younger children. However, adults are not so much susceptible to this because under normal circumstances, they've got a wide range of life experiences to draw from. And older persons, because of their age, simply sometimes don't perceive things as well, and their memory especially can tail off if that perception hasn't been firmly established. Occupation can have an impact. As I said, police officers, for example, are more acutely aware of what's going on around them than other individuals are, but there are other occupations that require a lot of close attention to what you're doing and an observation of the surrounding events to determine if it's impinging upon what you're doing. And that's part of your occupational learning, and you do that almost automatically. Confidence, witness factors. When an eyewitness gets on the witness stands and starts talking about, I'm absolutely positive that this is the person, you have to begin to examine why that person's absolutely confident. It may only be that they've convinced themselves over a period of months between the incident and the trial that this is in fact the person, especially if they've done a photo array or if they've done a lineup that has simply firmly rooted this person in their mind, and they picked this person out of the lineup, and now they sit there and study them as opposed to the fleeting opportunity they had while the event was occurring. And confidence can be cross-examined successfully. It's It's a tedious methodology, but it very often produces results because you're trying to expose the fact that the person really hasn't focused on the suspect or on the person they're identifying, especially when you start asking them about peculiar features of the individual, or describe the shape of the person's nose, describe the color of their eyes, the color of their hair, the kind of clothing that was being worn. Now let's describe it in detail. And again, you start to erode away the concept of confidence. And who are we eroding this for? The jury. Because you've got to overcome in the jury's mind the fact that this person said, that's the person. I'm 100% sure. If you are a successful cross-examiner. The next thing that you want to be aware of is that personality characteristics come into play. And there's not a lot of research that establishes clear borderlines, but anxious people or people who are neurotics, not to mention sociopaths, have sometimes a distorted view of perception, and they see things and interpret things as a result of this emotional disability as opposed to seeing things as they actually are. And they place references and significance to events that don't deserve that level of attention nor deserve that interpretation. And again, it's really difficult to test this kind of situation in laboratory testing. And the gender of a witness, there's very little difference in perception between a male and a female, but it's not really clear. Again, the research really doesn't draw any bright lines. Changes in original memory, non-existent objects, compromised memories, alterations in memories, type of questioning, and the timing of misleading information. First of all, non-existent objects. After an event, people may be subject to putting people into a scene that didn't exist because their life expectation says it should be there. Therefore, it is there. And over time, the memory changes to include that object. And subtle suggestion can also include that object. For example, another eyewitness says, well, there was this so-and-so there. There was this vase there. There was this dog there. The other person didn't see the dog, wasn't aware of it. And suddenly, over a process of attrition, the dog becomes part of their description of the event, even though they never perceived it at all. Compromised memories. That's when you start bringing concepts together that shouldn't be a part of the process. And it's not easily explained, but I guess the notion challenges the concept of forgetting. It's called an interference theory. People forget details in an event because something else they learned prevents the original from being remembered. New knowledge interferes with the ability to recall the original, and instead the person is likely to recall only the new information. And this can occur quite frequently. The memories are neither original nor the new version, but become a blend of both of them. Alterations in memory. They don't have the opportunity to compromise between original memory and subsequent information, and they will opt for one or the other. And therefore, the person unwittingly will either be correct in their recollection or they will be completely incorrect in their recollection. And there's really no testing other than the circumstances surrounding the incident to attempt to clarify which one of those two concepts is actually the driving force in a witness's identification or a description. The type of questioning, this is also used in hypnosis, and is why hypnosis is a problem. The leading questions suggest an answer, And in hypnosis, and because of the relaxed state and the willing state of the person who is undergoing the hypnosis and the trust level that they have accorded the person they're working with, they want to please that person, and they will give that person an answer. The name for that, the psychological name for that, is confabulation. They actually create something to please the questioner. For example, the leading questions, like we used in that example I gave you in the Inns of Court dinner. What was the color of the car? Well, there may be no evidence that there was even a car, but persons under some circumstances will give a color to, it may be their favorite color, it may be the last car they saw, but they're going to give a color and maybe even start providing more detail in the description of the car, even though they never saw one, because they're responding to this leading question, and over a period of time, well, that car should have been there, or it was there, or it was an attempt to answer the question and appear to be well informed. After all, nobody wants to look stupid on the witness stand. So they make stuff up, and of course, that becomes even more stupid. That's why we call them leading questions. They lead people around to make responses that they ordinarily wouldn't make. The timing of misleading information. Memory can fade rapidly, and a person's recollections for events then become more hazy. But if information is given, misleading information, immediately after viewing the incident, it'll have a great effect. And a study by Professor Loftus has indicated that after having been shown a video, a group of people correctly answered the questions a little over 50% of the time, whereas persons giving misleading information later on got the correct questions 20% of the time. And the actual straight questions results of the Inns of Court study I discussed closely mirrored the 50% correct response, which means 50% of the lawyers and judges in the room were incorrect in their responses. Although the second question sheet, that is using the leading questions, was no correlation. There's no correlation with Professor Loftus's studies. Some facial memory in the eyewitness. Here's the things that people remember, and in the order in which they remember. The general structure of the person's face. Next, they look at the eyes, then the nose, then the skin, the mouth, the lips, the chin, hair, and ears in that order. As a matter of fact, I will let you in on a little secret. Ears don't change. And ears are one of the things that facial recognition software that's used in security areas and in airports and so forth use the ears as a touchstone, because the shape and position of the ears doesn't change, and it's difficult to disguise. And so that is actually a good feature to focus on. Needless to say, the color of the eyes, the distance between the eyes, great or small, where they are in the structure of the head, the nose, how large it is, the general shape of it. Is it aquiline? Is it broad? The skin, is it abrased? Is it pockmarked? Is there facial hair on it? Shape of the mouth, thin lips, wide lips, chin, and hair, color of the hair, the length of the hair, the position of the hair, and so forth. Of course, some of these things, like the hair, that can be changed by dyeing and clipping and so forth. But again, the general structure is what people look at. And in eyewitness identification cases, these are the kinds of questions that a cross-examiner is going to ask of the witness in order to try to convince the jury that they really didn't see what this person, because their eyewitness identification is not based on anything that they can point to. General impressions don't work, and this is a way of attacking credibility. Facial memory and the eyewitness. Frequency. How often have you seen the person? Familiarity with the face. Detail salience, and what I've just talked about in the last slide. Cross-racial identifications are very, very suspect sometimes because of the narrow focus that's imposed. For example, if you're not familiar with and don't interact with persons of another race, and typically here for a long time the problem was between Caucasians and black individuals, because the first thing you see is what you remember. Well, I was a black guy. I was this white dude. That's the first thing that you see. That's the first thing that you perceive. And that may be the only thing you remember because of that. And again, the more time that you have, you might take the time to associate with it, or you might be looking for other features that reinforce your stereotype that you perceive. So this is a very, very fluid process, and you have to be aware of the kinds of things that can affect it and the kinds of questions you have to ask to make certain that this witness is making valid identification. Unconscious, I'm not going to talk about interference, but unconscious transference is really scary because that does happen. And essentially, that involves having become familiar with a person's face or with an individual. Let's say you see them every morning at the Starbucks on your way to work. And then later on, a crime occurs and you're present at it. You see some people at the scene of the crime who may or may not be suspects. And later on, you're shown a lineup. And there, sure enough, there's a person who looks a lot like the guy you remember at the Starbucks. You may have a subconscious response to that person in the lineup, but it's not based upon having seen them at the scene of the crime. It's based upon having seen them at the Starbucks. And you might identify them as the suspect in the lineup because of that unconscious transference. And this really does happen. It's difficult to pin down in individual situations. And unless you know the other person and can confront the witness with that other person and say, well, this is really who you're talking about, right? And get them to say, oh, yeah, that's who I was thinking about. At the Starbucks, oh, yeah. Think of the many times that you walked along the streets and you suddenly see somebody and you think you know them, but you can't remember where you know them from. Now, that may actually be a valid identification that you know this person from some situation, or it may just be that they look like somebody you know from another situation and you can't place that. And this does happen, and it's probably happened to you, and it's part of the eyewitness identification problem. Identification by other senses. We do voice identification. Of course, I'm familiar with his voice on the telephone, and that's him, or that's her. Or I have recognized this voice when the person said, give me all your money or I'll shoot. And that's why they have suspects in lineups repeat statements that assailants have used to see if the individual can also recognize the voice for the purposes of identification, or if it stimulates their recollection of the physical features of the individual when it's accompanied by the voice. The voice identifications are significant, and of course, voice recognition software at first was awful, but it's being developed and fine-tuned consistently, and sooner or later, the patterns will be sufficient enough to make an in-court identification. Of course, the original response at the crime scene or on the telephone has to be recorded, and it has to be effectively recorded. Otherwise, doing after-incident testing is very, very suspect. Sense of smell. Again, I was involved in a case recently where the smell of death was very, very important ingredient in the case. And one of the experts I was working with, Dr. Arpad Vass, was actually qualified by the court to testify that he could, based upon his 19 years of experience working at the body farm at the University of Tennessee, he could identify the odor of human decomposition and separate it out from other smells. And he was allowed to testify that the odor that he smelled from the carpet in the trunk of Casey Anthony's motor vehicle was the smell of death, which he allowed me to name odor mortis. So we now have the fourth mortis. We have odor mortis. And it's now recognized, and literature is starting to be generated as a result of that case, and further research is being identified as a result of that case. But the process is there. Of course, you got the Proustian moment, Emil Proust things remembered, where the smell of a woman's perfume immediately forces the character back a couple of decades and brings up an image of this woman that he was in love with and the things that they did, and his memory just blossoms out simply based upon the recognition of that perfume. And of course, perfumers do it all the time, have developed acute senses of smell based on that. And in addition, wine experts have done the same thing because the fragrance of the wine is very significant to them. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that eventually the sense of smell may be more heavily integrated into eyewitness identification because it's one of the five senses. Okay, here's a couple of examples. If you look at these two, I just look, first of all, in the center of the one on the black side and then the center of the one on the white side. By looking at either one of them, do you see that inverted triangle that's in the center of the picture? It's there. You see it? Yeah, well, it's not there. But your mind is telling you that I recognize a shape which appears to be a triangle. It's actually created by the features of the other objects in the picture, and has really nothing to do with there being another second triangle in either one of those pictures. Your mind is filling in the details. Read this one to yourself, and after you've done it a couple times, you read I Love Paris in the Spring. And actually what's happened is your mind has ignored that second THE at the bottom line. It actually says I love Paris in the spring. But because that doesn't fit with the saying as you know it, that second THE is ignored. Okay, here's a cultural expectation. Now this is actually part of testing in the 50s when, of course, racial disparity was more at the forefront of society than it is now. And here's a photograph. We have a black gentleman in a three-piece suit with one hand extended, the other hand in his pocket, and next to him we have a white individual, and he's pointing his finger at the black individual, and the white individual has his hand on his left hip holding something. When asked to describe this scene later on, people said that the black man was holding the razor blade, or the straight razor, that the white guy is actually holding in the picture, and was attempting to rob the white guy on this bus or this subway. And I'll show you here. See? There's his hand, the black man's hand. There's the razor blade, the straight razor, in the white guy's hand. These became reversed because the white people saw, based on their cultural expectations, that the black guy was robbing him. And that's what they saw. And we get a little close-up, you can see it again. Okay, temporary biases. This is called Rat Man. And if you look at it, the first thing you'll see is the shape of the rat. You see, the rat's mouth, his ears, and so forth, and comes around. Here's his hind legs, and here's the rat's tail. Now, if you take another look at it, what we've got is a broad chin, an ear, a cheekbone, two eyes, a nose, and a mouth down here. That's partially obscured. Look at this one. Focus on it. Just look at it for about 30 seconds. Do you see the little black squares between the big black squares at the intersections of the white lines? Your eye is creating those and filling them in. Your mind is doing that based upon its perception. And of course, the black squares are not there. But your eye is filling those gaps in subconsciously. Okay, let's look at this one. The horizontal lines, are they curved or are they straight? They're actually all straight. But because of the interference with the other objects that are in there, it makes it difficult for you to perceive them as being straight. Here's another classic example. Because of the divergent lines in the upper picture, those two lines in the upper graph appear to be bowing out around the circle in the center. In fact, those two lines are parallel to each other. And at the bottom picture, the same effect in the reverse is there. The convergent lines are creating the effect that these two lines are bowing towards the middle, when in fact they are both straight. And this is how your mind is processing this subconsciously. Let's look at all these. Now, in this image here, there is this circle and this circle. Which one of these two circles is smaller in the center? Circle on the right in the center, or the circle on the left in the center? Which one's smaller? Now, the one on the right appears to be smaller. In actuality, they are the same size, but taken in juxtaposition with what's around this large one, this looks comparatively small. And taking in consideration what's around this one, the smaller ones, this looks comparatively large. And your mind makes this assumption that that's large and that's small. And if I hadn't pointed that out later on, you'd say, well, the one on the left was smaller. Now this is pretty good, because just look at it and look at the center and look at it and just move your eyes around, and you'll see these things begin to spin a little bit. And your mind is doing that to you. They obviously aren't moving, but your mind is interpreting these things because of their shape and because of the image focuses in different directions. They appear to be moving. Here's another example. Because of the perspective lines that are drawn here, we expect things to change in perspective. In other words, the further away it gets, the smaller it becomes. Now we're going to look at these three. Which is the longest, and which is the tallest, and which is the shortest? So we have the tallest here and the shortest here. But in fact, they're all the same length. It's just because of the context, this one appears to be larger and this one appears to be smaller, but they're the same size. Your mind, again, is filling in information. This is a great one. Okay, we're going to look at this object here, which is casting a shadow over this checkerboard. Now, up here you'll see a square with a letter A on it, and down here you'll see a square with a letter B on it. Which square, A or B, is darker? A clearly appears to be. This juxtaposition is very, very clear. And this one is lighter, but it's very clear. Just looking at it by inspection, without studying it, A is darker until it isn't. Now you see that they are both the same color and the same shade. Okay? It's the shadow that's interposed here that makes it appear to be lighter versus darker. And again, this is simply your mind at work. And we've seen these things. This is a takeoff on the Escher constructions, because you start looking across the top and it looks like it's level and hooked onto a pier. And then if you look to the left of the picture, it still looks like it's level. All of a sudden, it's at the base of the pier. And we call these optical illusions, and that's exactly what it is. Because depending upon where you look in this illusion, you get a different perception. And your mind perceives it differently. And if you didn't see the whole thing, you wouldn't realize it. Now let's look at this. This is very simple. And let's think about the two trains for a moment. Do you have enough information? Can you decide whether this box edge, the vertical edge in the center, or the perpendicular edge rather, in the center is actually the back corner of the box or the front cover of the box. Are we looking at the bottom of the box from the inside or the outside? And you know what? You can't decide, can you? You know why? You don't have enough information. It can be either way looking at this. And if you look at the center point of the box, let's see if I can get my cursor on that. Right there, you can't tell which way, if this is going away from you or coming towards you. You can't tell because there's not enough information there for you to compare it with. You can't make a judgment on it. But if we start putting things in it, now we have some points of reference. You got a duck here with a shadow. So that's got to be the floor, and that point's got to be going away from us. This ribbon around it tells us, it's probably a box, and this is the bottom of the box, and this point is coming towards us. It's only because we added just a couple of elements that allowed you to make this distinction. Again, is this pamphlet facing you? Are you looking at the center binding facing you? Is it open facing you? Or is it upside down and laying on the facing pages, and this is pointed up towards you? Can't tell. We don't have enough information to make that call. Now this one, I like this one. This is experience-based. Look at it. And I'm willing to bet that every one of you who are looking at this sees a man embracing a nude woman. And that's based upon our perceptions and our experience. That's the first thing we see, and we recognize it because somehow or other in our mind's experience, if not in our actual experiences, we see a man caressing a woman. If we show this picture, however, to 4 or 5-year-old children, and by the way, this was done in a test, they don't see the two nude figures because it's not part of their experience. What they see are this fish here, this dolphin here, this dolphin, this dolphin, this dolphin, this dolphin, this one, and this one. That's what they see because that's within the scope of their experience, and they can interpret this picture that way. I wish to acknowledge my indebtedness to the following sources, which I have used for my liberal quotations in this section of my presentation on eyewitness identifications. In particular, Psychology, Law, and Eyewitness Testimony by Peter Ainsworth, and also particularly 52 BCL Law Review 651, note, Making the Jurors the Experts, the Case of Eyewitness Identification by Jury Instruction by Christian Sheehan. Also, 68 Washington and Lee Law Review 765, Through the Lens of Federal Evidence Rule 403, An Examination of Eyewitness Identification Expert Testimony Admissibility in Federal Circuit Courts by Lauren Talent, and last but certainly not least, Eyewitness Testimony by Elizabeth Loftus. Again, I appreciate the literature that these individuals have created and also the intense amount of research that's gone into the preparation of these sources.
Thank you. And this concludes the lecture on Part 2 of Module 11.